Here are a few examples of presidential promises during campaigns that didn't pan out. Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election in 1916 with this slogan, "He kept us out of the war." But just 29 days after he was sworn in for his second term, he asked the joint session of Congress to declare war against Germany, which 2 days later came about. In his 1928 campaign for president, Herbert Hoover offered a campaign slogan that promised a chicken in every pot and a car in every backyard to boot. But just 8 months after taking office, the bottom fell out of the stock market, plunging the country into the Great Depression. When Lyndon B. Johnson ran for president in 1964, he promised this: "We're not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." Not only did we enter the war with Vietnam, but the war escalated several times in his administration with a loss of nearly 57,000 or 58,000 American lives and over 2 million civilian lives. One of the most famous failed campaign promises came from the lips of George Herbert Walker Bush. Yeah, that's exactly right. He said it to the Republican convention in 1968. He said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." But after failing for months to get a budget passed through Congress with deep spending cuts, Bush admitted that increases in tax revenue were necessary to dig America out of a persistent recession. And those tax increases took effect almost immediately. And then George W. Bush promised in his campaign in 2000 to reduce government spending, adding these words. He said, "If we don't stop extending our troops all around the world in nation-building missions, then we're going to have serious problems coming down the road, and I'm going to prevent that." But during his 8 years in office, government spending skyrocketed, largely due to 2 new wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11. Now, the Bushes both faced circumstances in their years in office that made their promises impossible to keep. In fact, all these presidents found that to be true in their administration, because one cannot predict the crises and circumstances that will arise in the future to disrupt even the best laid plans of our leaders. So what does that tell us about placing so much trust in the promises of our leaders? Now, politicians are not the only ones who make bold promises that circumstances beyond their control disrupt and destroy. I mean, what parent has not made a promise to his child that he fully intended to keep, but something came up in life? A storm, the job, sickness, whatever, and it messed everything up. A well-meaning employer may make a promise of a healthy year-end bonus to his employees in September, but a horrible fourth quarter can put a kibosh on all of that. And then, in the heat of a guilty confession of sin to God, who hasn't made a vow to change that completely blew apart the very next time the temptation presented itself? We humans have a hard time making bold statements that in the end find the light of day. We simply do not know what our future holds, not even an hour from now. But our God, and only our God, who is eternal and sees from the end from the beginning all at once, holds the future in his hands. Why then would we place our confidence and trust in anything or anyone less than in him alone? Today, in our world, there are many competing gods out there making bold statements about what they can deliver to us in this life. And we want to believe these bold statements, and to the extent that we do, this is the stuff of idolatry in our lives. So what are the things that present us the boldest claims from which we're most apt to fashion our own false gods? In the ancient world, they made their idols out of stone and wood and metal. From what do we make our idols? Let me suggest a few things this morning. First of all, we make our idols from things that impress us. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 19, the children of Israel were warned, when you look up at the sky and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the heavenly array, do not be enticed into bowing down to them and worshiping things the Lord your God has apportioned to all nations under the sun, under the heavens. See, mankind has always been sort of in awe of what they see in the heavens. Historically, humanity has. The universe is so massive and so magnificent, and we're so small and insignificant in comparison. The amazement that we feel at what we see has mistakenly led many to glorify those celestial objects rather than the Creator who set them in their places. Thus, religions sprang up all over the world whose worship was focused on the sun or the moon or the zodiac. What inspired awe became objects of worship. And this is what Moses, God through Moses, was trying to warn the people of Israel about. What impresses us today? We're impressed by what we see in the sky, but we're not likely to bow down and worship the sun. What impresses us today? What are the things, who are the people of whom we are most in awe? Who do we idolize? To whom do we look when we're in a crisis today? Let me suggest that we are impressed with intelligence. If someone has a degree behind his or her name, that person is an expert, especially if that degree came from Harvard or Yale or Stanford or MIT. These are the ones that we look to lead us out of our crises. These are the ones with the science behind them who will save us. Now, this hasn't only been true during COVID, but increasingly it's the case in many other areas of life as well. We are impressed with the intelligence, for example, of a man like the late physicist Stephen Hawking. When he spoke of the origins of the universe, most people took notice, even though late in life he declared that there is no need to believe in a designer or God because we have gravity. Now, maybe I missed something, but where did gravity come from? And how did that eliminate the need for a creator? But for many, because Stephen Hawking said it, it must be so. After all, who is smarter than him? He believes in the theory of evolution as an explanation for origins, therefore, so should we. Those who impress us with their intelligence can become like gods to us. We look to them. We follow them and their reasoning. So we're impressed by those with intelligence, but we're also impressed with celebrities. Whether they come to us from an athletic venue, a stage, a movie screen, or a pulpit. We tend to idolize well-recognized people. Some take their appreciation of celebrities to the level of an unhealthy obsession. They find almost their meaning in life based on the performance of their favorite personality. Now, we Christians can get caught up in this kind of a thing. We can identify with a certain preacher or author almost to the point where we're more identified with them than we are with Jesus. And if that's the case, that's idolatry. So we're impressed with intelligence, we're impressed with celebrity, but we're also impressed with success, especially financial success. It's always been a temptation to believe that those with the most power, the most money, the most influence are superior to the rest of us for some reason. That's how they got their stuff. And if so, we who remain should try to be more like them or to follow them. Christians have been known to equate success with God's blessing. And so, in striving to be like the successful, we're willing to lose sight of God's purpose for us in order to chase the success of those we idolize. And so we copy the successful rather than seek God's direction for our own selves or our own church. And some have done so to the point where health and wealth have replaced the gospel as the goal of the Christian life. And that too is idolatry. The Apostle James warned believers in our glorious Lord Jesus must not show favoritism to the wealthy and the successful. The ones who impress us are merely humans. Exceptional humans, perhaps, but they're not God. The psalmist warned us, do not put your trust in princes, in human beings who cannot save. When their spirits depart, they return to the ground, and on that very day, their plans come to nothing. Blessed are those whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord, their God. We tend to make our idols from things or people who impress us. But the one who should impress us is our God. Not the impressive things he has made or the impressive creatures who are merely reflections of his glory. We make idols out of things that impress us. But we also make idols out of things that seduce us. And there are many things that do that. In her book, The Writing Life, author Annie Dillard tells of entomologists who conducted experiments on male butterflies. They painted a cardboard replica of a female of their species, only the cardboard replica was much larger and more enticing. And what they found was that the males were more attracted to the cardboard cutout, attempting over and over again to mate with it. Meanwhile, nearby, real living female butterflies were opening and closing their wings in order to attract, but in vain. Our enemy adopts a similar strategy with us, doesn't he? He will distort a gift that God has given to us and offer it to us in ways that are contrary to God's design for that good gift. And because it is marketed as bigger and better and less restrictive, we are seduced to ignore God's best for us, to pursue with gusto Satan's twisted replacement of God's gift. Sex, for example, is a gift that God has given to us to bring joy into a marriage between a man and a woman. And that's the boundary that God has set for it. But what our enemy offers as a seduction is a smorgasbord variety of options in the area of sexuality, promising freedom and pleasure without the need for accountability. And it sounds really good to our flesh. And even though it falls far short of its promise, we keep chasing it in the hopes that finally it will come through for us. Our world is as obsessed with sex as a means of defining our identity, as a way of making sense of life, as the highest experience in life. We've made an idol out of God's gift, giving it almost divine status in our lives. It seduces us with a false promise and then leaves us continually unsatisfied. Now, there are other seductions our enemy uses to do the same thing. Wealth, achievement, climbing the corporate ladder, accumulating the latest and greatest toys, becoming an influencer of others so that they do what we do and as we say. These are all offered as better alternatives for life than simply being who God has made us to be and faithfully serving him with the gifts he has given us. And so we chase these other things with a religious devotion because we have come to believe that this is what life is really all about, chasing these things. And so we make idols out of those things that seduce us. Thirdly, we make idols out of things that we're afraid of. Whenever mankind degenerated into pagan idolatry, the common theme was the appeasement of the anger of the gods. So if there was a drought, the god of the harvest was obviously angry, and so it withheld its bounty. The worshipers then were obliged to find out why this god was angry, identify the cause, and then do something to compensate for it, usually by means of a sacrifice or a display of loyalty. If the cause was identified as a person in their community, this person had angered the gods by doing something or by not doing enough, then that person would have to be punished for the sake of the community. Often this involved the death of that one as a sacrifice to the gods. At other times, the gods required an innocent sacrifice to satisfy the sense of being slighted, so a child or a virgin would be sacrificed. Fear, then, was often the motivation behind the formation of these deities that were worshipped in pagan societies. The Canaanite religion, death. Wow. Death, or Mot, was worshipped as a god. The sea, Yam, another force of nature to be feared, was worshipped as a god. Other polytheistic religions worshipped gods who represented anger, vengeance, bloodlust, and cruelty, forces within life that terrorized people. The Bible tells us, however, that only God is to be feared. But when we do fear Him, we need fear nothing else. They cannot hurt us. This is what we are told in Psalm 34. David wrote this. He said, I sought the Lord, and He answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to Him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. This poor man called, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamped around those who fear Him, and He delivers them. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in Him. Fear the Lord, you His people, for those who fear Him lack nothing. Now, the Bible doesn't suggest that there's nothing to fear. There are plenty of things to be afraid of: disaster, pain, even death. But we can be so consumed with fear that those fears loom larger to us in our minds and in our hearts than God does. And when they overwhelm us, then they have assumed a position above God in our minds and our hearts. And then they become idols. Today, the media hypes the things in the world that we fear. I mean, what makes the evening news but wars and hurricanes and fires and diseases and murders and gloomy economic forecasts, and to say nothing of terrorism and socialism and racism. If you were to be honest with yourself, what are the fears that often loom larger in your mind than God? Is it physical affliction, disease, injury, cancer, pain, death? Is it a relational issue? Broken trust, rejection, division, failed relationships, lack of respect shown toward you, estrangement, social anxiety, or judgmentalism at the hands of others? Is it a financial crisis that looms larger in your mind and heart than God? An unexpected expense, a job loss, a foreclosure, stock market collapse, or poverty? Is it global concerns that seems larger to you than God? Terrorism, pandemic, war, cyber attack, hostility among nations? Or is it environmental disaster? Climate change, weather events, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, pollution, overpopulation, earthquakes. Are they bigger than God? How about political turmoil, left versus right, competing ideologies, that we have to contend with? Is it personal calamity that looms sometimes larger to you than God? The death of a loved one, the loss of your personal security? Or is it social threat? Abortion, racism, breakdown of the family and marriage? Are those the things that loom larger? And then there's always the potential unknown trouble, whatever it may be that cannot be anticipated, so we fret about what might happen. You can see how easy it is for fears to overwhelm us to the point that we lose sight that our God alone is God and we are His. And He holds us in the palm of His hand, and we have a future that cannot be taken away by any of those things that we fear. Our fears can rob us of any real experience of the power of God, and although we do not bow down to them exactly, we can be consumed by them. And that is idolatry. From what else do we make our gods? In addition to the things we've already suggested, we also make idols out of things that give us a sense of security. In the ancient world, a good harvest, a full storehouse, a sharp sword, and a strong community gave a person a sense of well-being. Kings made alliances with other nations so that if an aggressor ever attacked, their friends would come to their aid. It also increased the size of their army, making one's defense that much more formidable. But the problem for the child of God is when we feel safer by these means than by our reliance on God. Psalmist wrote, "No king is saved by the size of his army. No warrior escapes by his great strength. A horse is a vain hope for deliverance. Despite all its great strength, it cannot save. But the eyes of the Lord are on those who fear Him, on those whose hope is in His unfailing love, to deliver them from death and keep them alive in famine." We wait in hope for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. In Him our hearts rejoice, for we trust in His holy name. Now, there's nothing wrong with feeling safe or protecting one's sense of security. There's nothing wrong with a nation building a strong national defense. In fact, it's wise to do so, as long as we understand that the safest of environments that we may create for ourselves and the most stringent security measures that we may take cannot assure us that nothing will go wrong. Nor can they protect what matters most, our souls and our eternal destinies. How many armies in history with superior numbers and more advanced armaments have been defeated by a lesser force because of a greater tenacity or a better strategy, or because the forces of nature combined to bring that superior army to his knees? Germany expected to make a quick work of the Soviet Union when it invaded it in World War II. Ultimately, it was the weather that slowed, then stalled them, leaving them completely unprepared for a long, cold winter. Meanwhile, the Russian forces were able to regroup and counterattack to drive Germany back. Military superiority was undone by the forces of nature. The hope that they had placed in their power could not save them. Our hope is in God. All other things in life that give us a sense of security can and easily do fail. We may put our hope in a strong retirement income to fund our golden years, or put our trust in the latest of vitamin supplements to bolster our immunities and protect us from cancer, or depend on diffused lavender to calm and to relax us in stressful days. But at best, all of these preventative measures are just temporary. If our sense of safety and security is bound to a particular leader, or to a stronger military, or to a sounder economy, or to a spouse, if we can only feel safe when our children are happy and successful, if we can only feel unthreatened when everyone agrees with what I think and practices what I feel is best, then I have placed my hope in a false god. And so I am an idolater. God is greater than all those things. It is He in whom I trust. He will save me. He will protect me because I am His. So I can make an idol out of things I look to for security, but I can also make an idol out of things that I need. There are things that we need in this life. We need air, we need food, we need shelter, we need clothing, we need love. After challenging his followers to not worry about food, drink, and clothing because our Heavenly Father will look after those things just as He looks after the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, Jesus said this, "So do not worry, saying, 'What shall we eat?' or 'What shall we drink?' or 'What shall we wear?' For the pagans run after these things. And your Heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." Now, Jesus acknowledges right here that we have needs, but what He warns against is running after those things like the pagans do. Now, and of course, the reference to pagans is specifically a reference to their religion. That's what makes them pagans, not their behavior or uncivilized lifestyles. Paganism is a polytheistic, idolatrous religion that was common in Jesus' day. So in Jesus' words, we find a direct link to the way idolatrous people chase after their needs, and then a contrast in how those who follow Him view their needs. Idolatry is built around chasing after our needs. They become all-consuming. But in contrast, a follower after Christ chases righteousness. He or she pursues a life that is pleasing to God. That's what we chase after once we come to faith in Jesus Christ. This is what it means to seek His kingdom first. We set God's kingdom and the values of His kingdom above all other pursuits in life. Why? Because that's what we were made for. This is why God created us and saved us. He didn't save us so that we could be consumed with merely surviving here and now. He put eternity in our hearts, and He gave us a purpose to reflect Jesus in a way that draws others into His grace. And when we do that, God's promises to take care of our needs. He will give us what we need to live lives that are productive and righteous. I did not say that He will give us everything that we desire, but He will give us everything we need to accomplish what He has called us to. And He has called us to a life of righteousness, and He has called us to a life of productivity for His kingdom's sake. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't go to work and care for our families, but it means that we don't fret after our earthly needs because God has those. Fretting about what we need is idolatry. We're placing those things before God's kingdom. There's one final ingredient in our idol making. From what do we make our false gods? We make them out of things that remind me of me. In other words, me. And when Satan tempted Adam and Eve in the garden, he got them not only to think that God was holding on them, but he got them to believe that they could be like God. It was what he had attempted and why he was cast out. Ingrained within our sin nature is the lie that we can rule our own lives, that we can be our own gods. But we are not God. There's only one of Him. And yet we struggle with this notion, every one of us. We all do. We want God's job. We struggle trying to manipulate God to do what we want. After all, who knows better about what I want than me? God just needs to get with the program and do what I say. And then I grow frustrated with God because he refuses to do things my way. Why do I do that? I do that because I've begun to think that God is like me, only bigger. And so I fear he gets angry like I do and responds to trouble like I do. I begin to think that what makes sense in my mind must then be the best course of action for God to take in my behalf. What am I doing? I am fashioning my God in my image. I'm making an idol that looks and smells and acts like me. And then calling it God. It is not. I have made an idol. And this, I believe, is our greatest idolatry. Trying to get God to fit into how we want him to be, which usually is just a bigger, more powerful version of me. We are idolatrous people, you and I. Even after we have been redeemed by God's grace. Idolatry is that vestigial appendage of our sin nature that we constantly have to deal with. Now, of course, lost people in our culture are idolatrous, but so are we when we make false gods out of things that impress us and things that seduce us and things that we're afraid of, things that give us a sense of security, things that we need, and things that remind me of me. What are the idols that you're most susceptible to? What are your idols made of? They're not real. God is real. He is who he is. And that's why we worship him as he is, not as the world sees him or as how we might want him to be. Our problem is that we're so earthbound. It's all we know, and it's so difficult to imagine anything other than the here and the now. But God has made provision for our here and now. But our destiny is not here. Our hope does not reside here. We have a future where all things that impress us or seduce us or make us afraid or give us a false sense of security or promise to meet our needs are gone. Where all these things are perfectly cared for forever. That's our future in Christ. The problem is that we have attempted to reduce God to the present struggle only. He's in it with us, definitely, but he's also beyond it and above it, and so are we. One of my favorite authors, David Paul Tripp, wrote this. When we ask the present to give us what only eternity can give, we end up driven, frustrated, discouraged, and ultimately hopeless. Let's be careful not to let the present dictate to us who God is. Because we have hope. And it is a certainty. Settling for anything less is idolatry. Let's not do that anymore. Jesus is enough, just as he is.